Hey beauty babes, welcome to my channel. I'm Maria, aka Agape Love Girl. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today I want to do a quick video sharing my thoughts as well as some swatches on the new Urban Decay Naked Reloaded palette, as well as share about a dupe palette that I found that you may already have in your collection. And no, it's not the Anastasia Beverly Hills Sultry Palette that everybody is comparing this to. So with that, let's go ahead and get into it. Now I know this palette is somewhat old news. I mean, even though I still feel like it's fairly new to the market, I feel like by now it's already kind of old news, but I still found some interesting things about it and wanted to share my thoughts. I know it was recently on sale for the Ulta 21 Days of Beauty, or might still be on sale, so I know some of you guys might have picked it up during that time, but if you were still on the fence about this palette, I want to share my thoughts on it that might help you as well. It is what I have on my eyes today, and if you did pick up this palette, I am working on a 6 looks, 1 palette with this, so that video will be up in the near future. So if you're looking for some inspiration with this palette, you will have that in the future, so definitely stay tuned. Now with that, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the palette. I'm not going to go into too much detail because most of you guys have probably seen and already know, but I do want to mention that I think the packaging is super beautiful. I love that it's this new kind of cushy palette. When you open it up, there is no brush, and I actually kind of appreciate that because I never really use the brushes in the palette. I feel like most people don't, but I could be totally wrong, so some people may or may not like that, but the price is a little bit cheaper. I believe if I'm remembering correctly, it is $44 compared to the $49 price tag that most other naked palettes are, so I think that's really nice. In my opinion, that was I think a good choice for Urban Decay to move towards this kind of style without the brush included. Next up, the other new thing about this palette is that it does have some larger pan sizes on the outsides. I think if I'm looking at it correctly, the very two on the outer are the largest pans. These, to my naked eye, they look like they are slightly smaller. They are bigger than the rest, but they look slightly smaller than this. They could be actually the same size, but to me they look like they're slightly smaller. And then the rest of them are the normal smaller pan size. Again, I do think this was kind of a smart move on their part to do this, because we all know there are shades that we tend to use a lot more than the rest in the palette. And so having those be a slightly larger so you don't hit pan as quickly before you use up the rest of the shades, I think is really, really smart. However, I do have one kind of little tiff about this, and sometimes I wonder if talking about what we don't like about a palette and what we wish we could change about a palette and what they would have done is even helpful at all, because obviously the palette is done, nothing can change about it, but I figured it's still helpful to share in case you haven't picked this up or you're on the fence. This might be something that you want to think about that may help you to decide not to purchase, or it may be something that doesn't bother you and you will go ahead and purchase. So anyways, I just figured I would share. Now as you can see, we have two kind of creamy shades here on the end for the largest pans, and I think that they did great with doing that. We have Bribe, which is kind of like your it's like a satin. It's a really beautiful kind of creamy white, could be a brow bone highlight type of shade. And then on the other end we have Blur, which is a little bit more brown. It's matte, very, very soft, as you can see, and I have heard a lot of people talk about they love this shade. It's a perfect kind of blending, blurring shade to use, and so I do think those are two shades that probably would be used quite a bit in this palette, and it's smart to have those as the largest sizes in this palette. Next up, for the second kind of larger pans in the palette, we have Barely Baked, and this is actually the shadow that's on my eyelids today, and it's a beautiful shade, a beautiful gold shade. And then over here we have Boundaries, which is kind of a warmer tone matte brown shade that has a little bit of micro shimmer or micro glitter in it, and they look like this. Now in my opinion, here's where I think they kind of went wrong. I just feel like these two shades shouldn't have been here. I really think the smart thing to do would have been to add the darkest shadow in this palette, Endgame, and make that one of the largest pans in this palette. And I feel like that would have been better, because as I've been using this palette, as I've been creating looks with this palette and tutorials with this palette, I find that I reach for Endgame for almost every single look, because it is the only real dark shade in the palette. I feel like it's the only one you have to kind of deepen up a look if that's what you want to do. And so I feel like I will use this more than probably any other shade in the palette. I've used it even more than this one here, Bribe, and so I feel like that should have been a larger pan. And then additionally, the next shade that I felt like I've used the most for every look is this one, Retro, this kind of corally orange shade right here. And I feel like that would have been really smart to have as, again, one of the larger shades. So these two instead of these two, because I feel like I actually have only used this once as a, you know, a lid shade, which I did today. But there's so many other options for a lid shade that, like, I don't know why they chose to make that one the standout one. Maybe they thought more people would use this more than anything. I'm not quite sure, but I just don't think it was smart to make one of the shimmer shades one of the larger shades when it's probably one that you won't use as much as, say, like a transition color or a crease color like this, or one to deepen up, you know, your look like this one here, Endgame. So I really think it would have been so much better if they, you know, had made those larger. So I did want to mention that, because even though that can't change, that does let you know that I do feel like if you're like me and you think these are two shades you might reach for a lot, they're just the standard size, so you might hit pan on these sooner than a lot of the other shades. And if that's something that may bother you, that's something worth noting. Otherwise, you might not care, and that's totally fine. Now, speaking of Endgame, the darkest shade in the palette, my one kind of disappointment, because I can overlook the size of the pants and things like that, and this not being as big is totally fine for me. It's not like I don't think I will hit pan on it. I have so many shadows, I think I'm good. But the one disappointment to me was that I feel like I do wish they had at least one shade darker than Endgame in this palette. Maybe a black, or, you know, I don't know, because this is a pretty deep brown, and I do think it's nice that it can actually be applied pretty lightly as well as built up to be a little bit darker. But the fact that this is really the only deep shade in the palette, the rest of them, even the mattes and the transitions, are so light. There really is no other shade to deepen up your looks. You really only have this one to, if you really want to add some depth and dimension to your look. So I think it would have been smarter if they had a black in there. It's not a must, but I do think that would have been the smarter thing. And additionally, that being said, I almost think that they probably could have done without this shade, Boundaries. I feel like it's the one shade that I use the least out of every time, you know, I've done my makeup. I've kind of and used this palette, but I have kind of forced myself to use it because I'm like, oh, it's one of the largest shades, I might as well use that as one of my transitions. And I kind of just tried to remember and remind myself use that one instead. But to me, it just wasn't one that I really gravitated the most towards. So I feel like if they would have put a black in instead of this, it would have been a little bit better. Because also I just think these two are just very similar. Now, of course, this is the warmer tone. This one, Bucked, is a more of a cooler tone or neutral transition kind of brownie shade, but I just don't personally feel like they needed both of them. And so I don't know, that's kind of my one real gripe about this palette and the colors and the layout and stuff like that. Now, interestingly enough, I did end up watching a few other reviews of this palette after I've already played with it and developed my own thoughts, but I did find it interesting that a lot of people had said that they felt like Dreamweaver was actually a shade that they felt like didn't need to be included in the palette. Like it just wasn't a great shade, and one that didn't really complement the palette well. I kind of disagree. I really like Dreamweaver. I know a lot of people had said that it looks very similar to Distilled once they're actually applied in the eyes, and I think, like, I have some swatches I'm going to show you guys in a minute, and yeah, when you kind of swatch them out with your fingers, they do look kind of similar, but I do feel like they are different enough, especially if you apply this with a setting spray or a tacky base. You will get some of that silver, that pretty silverness of that shadow to show up, and it does make it different enough from Distilled to stand out. And I think it was really great for them to have this in the palette, because it is that, you know, really pretty cool tone silvery brown shadow that you know, allows you to create more versatile looks, in my opinion, and it is one of my favorite shades in the palette. But I will let you know that it is a little bit more of a difficult shade. It does take a little bit more pampering and babying to make it work, but once you make it work, it's really beautiful. Speaking of the difficult shades to work with, it always seems that Urban Decay always has at least one in their palette. This time there's two shadows that are just a little bit tough to work with, and that doesn't mean they don't work or they're not good. They're actually some of the most stunning shades in the palettes, but they just you look at them and you want them to apply so beautiful, but they don't always apply the way you want them, so you kind of have to baby them a little bit. And so those two shades are Dreamweaver, like I already mentioned, and then Angel Fire. Angel Fire was the very first shadow that I saw and gravitated towards, and it was just like, oh, I need to use this, it's so pretty. Both of these are very much more flaky shadows. Angel Fire is a little bit more creamy, but it is definitely flaky, and then Dreamweaver is very flaky and also a bit dry. So both of these definitely need to be applied with, like I said, a sticky or tacky base. Sometimes what I will do is just reapply some more eyeshadow primer and then pat that shade on top very carefully, or pick up some of the shadow with a brush and then spray the shadow on my brush with a setting spray. The Morphe setting spray is actually really, really perfect for these kind of shadows. And that allows them to apply just beautifully and allows that glitter and the flaky metallicness of these shadows to really show up and look beautiful. So if you're willing to do a little bit more work to make them work, they will apply stunningly. Now, another shade that's somewhat similar but not quite as difficult is the shade Reputation. This one is a lot more smooth and a lot more of a just a metallic shade, but this one also does have a little bit of shimmer and glitter into it. It's similar in beauty, but not nearly as difficult to work with. So I'll have some swatches that I'm going to show you here of all three shades side by side, applied and swatched with my finger, so you can get a better idea of the true pigmentation of them. And then I'm also going to show you swatches of Barely Baked, Burn, and Distilled right underneath them. Now those are just the kind of more regular metallic shades in this palette, and those shades are actually really, really beautiful and very, very easy to apply. Those I swatched with a brush. I used the Beauty Junkies All Over Shader brush, and they apply with a brush beautifully without any help needed, truly. And so I really appreciate how easy these are to work with and how smooth and pigmented they apply with little to no effort. Alright, so let's move on to talk about the possible dupe palette that I found that you may have in your collection you might not have thought about. Now, I will admit this is not exactly a dupe in that it has all of the same shades exactly, but I will just say that while I was doing a makeup look for one of the tutorials that will be in the upcoming video using this palette, I realized that after kind of finishing it up, I was like, wow, this look seems very similar. I think I've done this same exact look before, also using an Urban Decay palette. And that palette is actually the Kristen Leanne Daydream palette. Now, I had actually completely forgot about this palette, to be completely honest. Even though I did like it, I think it's beautiful, it performed beautifully, but with as much makeup as I get, you know, I sometimes forget about palettes, and I forgot about this palette until I created that look, and I was like, oh my gosh, I'm kind of recreating the same look that I've done before, but I didn't really think about it because it was a new palette. And so after I created that look, I had to go check for myself and see how similar the shades were. And to be completely honest, they are almost spot on identical, with the exception that I feel like the new Naked Reloaded palette has a couple shades that have a little bit more shimmer or you know, pearlescent look to them. But basically, and I'm going to show you the swatches here, they are pretty spot on the same. Now, just for your reference, the shades up top are all from the Kristen Leanne Daydream palette. I use all 5 of them, and then the ones on the bottom are from the Naked Reloaded palette. And the shades are Bribe, Blur, Retro, Boundaries, and Endgame. And just so you guys can see here, they are this the Daydream palette is just a 5-pan small all matte palette. So like I said, it's not quite a dupe in the sense of the full palette, but as far as 5 of the mattes in the Naked Reloaded palette are pretty much spot on for the ones in this Daydream palette. Now, of course, this is absolutely no shade to Urban Decay. I'm not trying to start drama. I think I kind of mentioned this kind of thing in another video I did when I was comparing the Backtalk palette to the the Naked Cherry palette. If you haven't seen that, I'll link that video, but this isn't about trying to throw shade or catch them in anything. It's just something that I noticed that I thought was worth mentioning for two different reasons mainly. One is that if you already have the Kristen Leanne Daydream palette, and maybe you forgot about it, or maybe you didn't, but you know, you have maybe been wanting the Naked Reloaded palette, you kind of evaluate, do you really need the Naked Reloaded palette, and is it going to be worth it just for the extra shimmers you will get because you already have the other shades in your collection pretty much. And then the other thing that I wanted to mention was that maybe you had wanted to get the Kristen Leanne Daydream palette and maybe you missed out on it or just didn't buy it for whatever reason, but those shades were shades that really called out to you, that you really wanted in your collection or you just really wanted in general. And if you did, well then you could kind of pretty much get those same exact shades in the Naked Reloaded palette, but with the bonus of the shimmers and metallics as well. So anyways, I do hope that you find that kind of helpful in deciding, if you have not purchased this yet, on whether you should buy or shouldn't buy, or want to buy or don't want to buy. I really just want to present you all the information that I have discovered for myself and, you know, to help you make the best decision possible. As for my opinions on this palette, I actually do really like this palette. When I first saw it teased, I feel like there was a lot of people who kind of threw shade, who said they didn't like it, who said it was boring, and just said it could never replace the original Naked palette, but I was actually really excited when I saw the palette. I think it's beautiful. These shades do speak to me because I am someone who definitely prefers a warmer tones. The original Naked palette was one that I didn't really care for that much. It is very much more of a cooler tone palette. It has a couple of those blues in there, which you guys know I don't really like blue that much, or I don't wear blue that much. I actually do have the original Naked palette. I received it in PR and I've actually, embarrassingly to admit, I have yet to even use that palette. That kind of also goes back to I'm always getting new stuff, so it's hard to kind of go back to that, but I haven't really had the desire either to really open it up and use it because it just doesn't speak to me the way this one does. I was actually really excited about it, and I was really excited to receive it in PR as well. I do think that from the most part, the shadows are very easy to work with. They're very pigmented, they're very soft and smooth and beautiful. I didn't used to be a fan of some of the Naked palettes because, especially the Naked 3, I just thought the shimmers were too hard pressed. It wasn't easy to use, not as pigmented as I would have thought or liked, but I feel like the formula of the newer ones, I'm thinking Naked Heat and On, have just blown me away, and I really, really like them. So I enjoy the Urban Decay Naked formula, and I really like this palette. But I do hope that overall the information I've shared, the comparison to the other palette, and if you have that in your collection, you know, issues with some of the shadows needing a little extra work, as well as, you know, the layout and my thoughts on, you know, what should have been or shouldn't have been added to this palette. I do hope that all the information is helpful to you and can help you make the best decision possible. So that's really my hope and desire with this video. So it's not really to tell you what to do, it's really just to help you make the best decision possible. And if you did already pick up this palette and you are enjoying it but want some inspiration, again, stay tuned to my video coming up. I'll be sharing, I think, 6 looks to inspire you. But with all that being said, I just want to thank you so much for watching, and until next time, much love and hugs to you. Bye, beauty babes. Mwah!